Alright, so in this one we are going to add a picture or an image for each one of these users, and then we also want to add something called get absolute URL, or as in the URL that goes directly to that particular user. So the first thing I'll do is actually add the pictures, and then we'll worry about the URL, or actually linking to those users specifically. Now, only one of these users actually has a profile image because that's the only one that I've actually updated. So if we go into our profiles, we see that that James Bond is the only one with an image. If we went through all the other ones, we could see that as well. So let's go ahead and go into our home.html where our matches live, and we want to iterate through these. So let's do a regular iteration by just doing for match in matches, and then I'll say in for, and I'm also going to comment out this form. We don't want that anymore. And then match. All right, so this is going to loop through each match, and we see that it's still in a list item here. So something we could do with this is we could actually say for match and then percentage, or just percent. We can loop through just like that. So now we could use match and percent, and now it's going to show us in a little bit of a better way. We see the username and the percentage and all that. Cool. So let's go back into our Sublime Text, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually bring in the image for this user. So first off, I'll put it into a new div class of being column small 4. Close off the div, and then in here I'm going to say image source equals to match is actually user, so we could say user, and I'll explain why it's user in just a second. And then we'll say class equals to image dash responsive, and then for the image we'll do dot profile dot picture dot URL. So why is it user? If we look back into our views for the home page, we see that our match set is going to be going through here, and then we actually append the match user, right? So user A or user B. So that's why it's user. So when we iterate through, it just makes more sense to call it user. So I'm actually going to call it matched user because user itself can be related to the request user. So if I refresh in here, oops, so match user profile dot picture. So we don't have, some of them don't have a profile picture, so we'll say if match user dot profile dot picture, and if. All right, so now some of the match users don't have a profile picture, as it showed that error. That's why the .url didn't actually work. Okay, cool. So now that we've got this, notice this user block right here. That's actually coming from the requested user itself. So if you had a different request user and you just use user, that would actually show whoever that request user is. So this is a way to get that user, just like what we do in the views when we do request.user. It's pretty much the same thing. There is another one that you might have seen in other Django videos of ours where we use request.user, and that also works as well, depending on how your template context is, but I'm not going to go into that right now. All right, so now that we have this, we have our loop of all these. We might also want to say else. We want to have a backup picture if they don't have pictures, right? So let's go ahead and actually add a backup picture. So into our static in Pro, we want to go into images, and I'm going to add an image in here for our backup picture. So I actually already downloaded this picture, and I just have a profile default. This is it, Heisenberg, and then I want to add this into my project, so I'm just going to drag it in, and then source, and then static in Pro, rstatic img. All right, so I drop that in, and we see here that we have profile default. So I want to actually use that profile default. Now if I hard code it, if I write it out, it'd be static / img / profile default .jpg, and that should run it, but we have to do something first. So that is python manage.py collect static, and this will collect our static files, and it collects everything that we see. So let's actually go into our static and env, into static root, into image, and now we have that profile default in there. Cool. So let's go back into our project and refresh. We need to run the server, of course. So python manage.py, run server, and we refresh in here, and now we have these default pictures, right? So they're actually coming through, which is cool. So that works out really nicely for us. But one thing that I don't like is, what if we change the name of profile default? Or rather, what if we change the static location? So the name we would always have to manually change in this case, but the static location, or how the static files are being served, this is a hard way to do it. So we actually want to do it the more Django way, which would be using the static template loader. So we want to do load static files. And instead of doing static like this, we're going to say static, and then double quotes, so the opposite of the outside of it. And then it goes to image/profile default. And if we go back into our page, it still loads those images. Now what's important about this is, if our static location, where we actually serve our static files, if that changes, let's say for instance it changes from webfaction.com to amazon.com, or Amazon's web server, we would be able to actually do that. So that's a way that this would still continue to work even though this part has changed. So that's important to note. But now that we have this, let's actually make these a little bit smaller. So I'm going to make a new div, so a div class equals to column small 4 as well. And I'm going to put it outside of this row, or outside of the for loop here. And then I'm going to just add a div column, so div class equals to column, or excuse me, div row, and we will put this down here. And then above it, I'm going to make a div class equals to column small 8, close that off, and then we'll just say h1, close that, and just say dashboard. And go back into Chrome, refresh, and now we have our dashboard, and we have matches over here. So this is actually starting to look pretty good. The other side of it is, we want to maybe say matches for this area, and I'll just give it an h3 tag of matches, and then we have this matches column working, at least showing to some degree. So in the next one, we actually want to link these to their user profiles. So that's something we'll do. And we also might want to clean up the design of this. So like how the images are not all the same size, we might want to actually make them roughly the same size, or at least make it look a little bit better than it currently does. So if you have any questions on this, let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going.